U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken delivered some of the Biden administration's strongest public criticism yet of Israel's conduct in the Gaza war.
Well, first, Mark, good morning. The report that we put out lays out some of the concerns that we've had throughout this period when it comes to humanitarian assistance, particularly the early months after October 7th, and when it comes to the use of weapons, concerns about incidents where, given the totality of the damage that's been done to children, women, men, it was reasonable to assess that in certain instances, Israel acted in ways that are not consistent with international humanitarian law. It's also critical to note that Israel itself has accountability processes to get at this. There are hundreds of ongoing inquiries looking at different incidents that have taken place since October 7th. There are criminal investigations that are going forward. Unlike most other countries in the world, Israel has the ability, the means, and the actions to self-correct. But we've been on this every single day.
Blinken refrained from setting a clear red line on Israel aid, but emphasized the necessity for a credible plan to protect the 1.4 million civilians seeking refuge in Rafah.
No, what we've concluded is, in the case of the use of weapons, as you said, this is an extraordinarily complex military environment in which you have an enemy, Hamas, that committed the most atrocious terrorist attacks on Israel on October 7th, and then retreats to Gaza, hides behind and underneath civilians in hospitals, schools, mosques, apartment buildings. And that makes it very difficult to determine, particularly in the midst of war, exactly what happened and to draw any final conclusions from any one incident. So we have a number of incidents that we continue to look at to try to get the best possible assessment. The Israelis themselves are doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Our assessments will be ongoing. But as I said, given the totality of what we've seen in terms of civilian suffering, in terms of children, women, men caught in this crossfire of Hamas is making, who've been killed or been injured, it's reasonable to assess that in a number of instances, Israel has not acted in a manner that's consistent with international humanitarian law.
So I understand you're still collecting evidence, but on the policy, can you clarify? Because even the lead Democrat on House Armed Services says it's not clear. Is the U.S. slowing down the delivery of any weapons to Israel at this point beyond the 3,500 so-called dumb bombs?
As you know, Margaret, most of the population from Gaza, displaced from the north and from central Gaza, has gone to Rafah. There are about 1.4 million people there. And we've said to Israel that we will not support an operation in Rafah, a major military operation, in the absence of a credible plan to protect civilians.
And they still haven't delivered it. So are you slowing the delivery of any weapons beyond these 3,500 bombs? Are you pausing, for example, precision munitions, as some Republicans have claimed?
The answer to that is no. What the president said, and what he's been clear about, in private conversations with the Israelis, which unfortunately leaked to the press, so the president responded forthrightly when he was asked about it. But what we've been clear about is that if Israel launches this major military operation into Rafah, then there are certain systems that we're not going to be supporting and supplying for that operation. But at present, the only thing that we've delayed and are holding back are these high payload bombs, because we're in an ongoing conversation with Israel, given the impact that those weapons can have when they're used in densely populated areas, including an area like Rafah. So we're in an active conversation with Israel about that. We have real concerns about the way they're used. But here's something else that's critically important, Margaret. We believe two things. One, you have to have a clear, credible plan to protect civilians, which we haven't seen. Second, we also need to see a plan for what happens after this conflict in Gaza is over. And we still haven't seen that, because what are we seeing right now? We're seeing parts of Gaza that Israel has cleared of Hamas, where Hamas is coming back, including in the north, including in Khan Yunis. As we look at Rafah, they may go in and have some initial success, but potentially at an incredibly high cost to civilians, but one that is not durable, one that's not sustainable. And they will be left holding the bag on an enduring insurgency, because a lot of armed Hamas will be left, no matter what they do in Rafah. Or if they leave and get out of Gaza, as we believe they need to do, then you're going to have a vacuum, and a vacuum that's likely to be filled by chaos, by anarchy, and ultimately by Hamas again.
Yeah.
So we've been working for many weeks on developing credible plans for security, for governance, for rebuilding. We haven't seen that come from Israel. We've been working with Arab countries and others on that plan. Mm-hmm. We need to see that too. We have the same objective as Israel. We want to make sure that Hamas cannot govern Gaza again. We want to make sure it's demilitarized. We want to make sure that Israel gets its leaders. That's what we're determined to do. We have a different way, and we think a more effective, durable way of getting that done. We remain in conversation with Israel about exactly that.
He highlighted the challenges of distinguishing between civilian infrastructure and Hamas facilities amid the ongoing conflict, making it difficult to navigate the complexities of the situation on the ground.
I think the report makes clear that while Israel has processes, procedures, rules, regulations to try to minimize civilian harm, given the impact that this operation, this war in Gaza has had on the civilian population.
And yet you're still surging weapons to Israel.
Those have not been applied consistently and effectively. There's a gap between the stated intent and some of the results we've seen. But because it's so complicated, in the midst of a war, and particularly in the midst of a war where you have an enemy that hides in civilian infrastructure, hides behind civilians, to make final determinations on these individual incidents. We're looking at the totality of what's happened. We think it's reasonable to assess, based on what's happened, that there have been acts that have been inconsistent with Israel's obligations under international humanitarian law, but we haven't drawn definitive conclusions. We need to pursue these investigations, just as Israel is doing itself.
Responding to Blinken's interview to Face the Nation, U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders said Israel has broken international law and American law.
And I have a lot of respect for Tony Blinken. He has an impossibly difficult job. But the reality is I think any objective observer knows Israel has broken international law. It has broken American law. And in my view, Israel should not be receiving another nickel in U.S. military aid. Look, the facts are quite clear. Hamas is a terrible, disgusting terrorist organization that began this war. But what Israel has done over the last 7 months is not just gone to war against Hamas, it has gone to war against the entire Palestinian people, and the results have been absolutely catastrophic. I mean, Kristen, we're talking about not just 35,000 Palestinians dead and 77,000 wounded, 2/3 of whom are women and children. That is not the way you conduct a war in a civilized society to the degree that war is civilized. We're talking about 60% of the housing in Gaza having been destroyed. The civilian infrastructure, that's water, that is raw sewage now running out into the streets, no electricity. You are talking about a systematic destruction of the healthcare system there. Every university in Gaza has been bombed. And right now, most frighteningly, according to the humanitarian organizations, we are looking at the likelihood of hundreds of thousands of children facing starvation. The Foreign Assistance Act is very, very clear, 6201, the provision. Any entity, any state, any country that blocks U.S. humanitarian aid is in violation of law and should not continue to receive military aid from the United States. That is precisely what Israel has done.